Hi, everyone. This is Stan Mallow, the Paranormal Yacker. Today's show is part 3 of a 3-part interview I did with Preston Dennett, author of Not From Here, Selected UFO Articles, Volume 4. In Not From Here, Volume 4, you tell the story of someone who's driving down a remote highway and picked up a strange-looking individual, only to find out that they aren't even human. Could you, Preston, tell me about that event, and are extraterrestrial hitchhikers more commonplace than we think they are?
I think they might be, because I'd heard of a few cases and didn't think much of it until I was reading one of R.D. Six Killer Clark's. I love her as a researcher. She's very unfiltered and just lays out the facts without putting any of her own. There are many researchers out there who are just kind of cherry picking and picking cases that fit what they believe is the truth about UFOs. And that's not how you do science. You lay out the evidence. She had a couple of cases. I thought, this is interesting, because I instantly thought of a few others. So I took a deep dive into the UFO literature and I found about 15 or 20 cases, and I included the best ones in the book. And one that comes to mind occurred in 1973. Jordan, this is in Ontario, Canada. A gentleman by the name of Tom Campbell had formed a music group. So he and his band members are packing up their gear one day when this man approaches and asks them for a ride. And they agreed, and they're on their way home. But instead of taking the normal route, they would go home the direct route. For some reason, they took a side street. This is significant because this happens in about 50% of these hitchhiker cases. People are diverted from their normal route. And we see this with a lot of onboard experiences. People will be on the highway, and the next thing they know, they're taking an exit and driving off to a remote area, and boom, they're picked up. That happened in this case. They come up, they're on this side road, and they come upon this landed UFO. Their van, these small figures approach, and the hitchhiker opens the door and basically starts escorting these men on board this craft. And it was a largely benevolent experience. It was a little bit frightening for some of them, but they were physically examined. And the main witness, Tom Campbell, says he actually gave one of these ETs his flute because they asked for it. So it was, sort of little friendly exchange. They asked about, religion, which is a question that comes up with a lot of contactees. They're like, what do you think of religion? And the ETs, I believe in this case, said that none of the religions have it quite right on your planet, which I thought was just an interesting aside. But at any rate, they were returned to the vehicle and the hitchhiker was gone. So that's sort of your typical case. There are many like it. One of the cases from R.D. Six Killer Clark involved a Native American gentleman who was driving towards Chinle, Arizona on a remote highway. This is a trip that should take an hour. It ended up taking twice that time. As he's driving along, he sees a man standing by the side of the road hitching a ride. And he thought it was another Native American. So being of the same culture, they stick together, and he decided to pick. But as the man got into the car, he realized that this was not another Native American. He had pale skin. He was dressed in a white jumpsuit, had unusual eyes, was very taciturn, wasn't talking much. And as they're driving along, they came upon a UFO right in the center of the road. This gentleman, the hitchhiker, exits the vehicle and walks right into the UFO, comes back a moment later with another gentleman, also dressed in a white jumpsuit, proceed to escort Dakota, is the man's name, onto the UFO. So this is the pattern we see in these cases. This is sort of a prelude to an onboard experience in many cases. Often involves what we would call human looking. I don't like the term Nordic. It's not always accurate in terms of being, pale skin and blonde, or they come in of all ancestries. This is sort of case we're seeing. If you see someone dressed very unusual on the highway, many of these people are compelled to pick them up. Normally, they would not pick up hitchhikers. They're quite conservative. There is a lot of talk about, the dangers of picking up hitchhikers, but still they do it. Very interesting. This is a very unusual type of case. So I don't think it's ever really been explored in depth. What I love doing, series of books, off the beaten path kinds of cases. To find so many of these hitchhiking ETs was really like, wow, this is a thing. This is happening. We should definitely be looking into it. So yeah, next time you pick up a hitchhiker who's dressed a little strange, looks a little different, definitely something to be aware of that could possibly be reported to MUFON. It was actually investigated by the head of MUFON, involving a pilot who was driving along through the desert, and this human figures by the side of the road. This is a remote area. There's no cars around, there's no buildings, there's no reason this person should be out there. But he stops, gives the man a ride. This man is very intelligent, starts talking about all these subjects, seems to know what the man is thinking. The driver says, well, who are you? And the guy says, well, I'm actually an ET, and I'm heading towards this location, which was in San Diego, which turned out to be exactly where this gentleman was going. It was clear that this was sort of set up or predetermined. But case after case like this, and often it's out in a remote area, no way this person could be there.
Certain specific areas on our planet are known as UFO attractors. Where are they, and why are ETs interested in them?
This was a theme that I really started to explore deeply in the Not From Here series. And one UFO attractor that I discussed in a previous volume was graveyard, because that shocked what interest could UFOs possibly have in graveyard. But the fact is they do. J. Allen Hynek had a case where people were driving along, a couple had just gone out of their home to look at the newly fallen snow, saw this weird fog hovering just over this one area, the graveyard. And inside the fog was a bright glowing light. So they slowed down and pulled alongside, and it was a UFO. And the gentleman, the driver, opened his door and kind of waved at this object, at which point he became temporarily paralyzed. This went on for a few moments. It was quite frightening for them, actually. This UFO was doing whatever it was doing, and then finally took off. The driver was able to move again, and off he went on his way. But it's a very well verified case in terms of it being investigated by J. Allen Hynek. I started looking into it because there was a book published by Bob Tietz called West Virginia UFOs. He's a mainstream reporter, decided to tackle this subject. He wrote one of the first books ever about UFOs over a certain state. He had found that the Bob Dean Memorial Cemetery, the Nethkin Cemetery, this is a group of graveyards all clustered together, were having so many encounters that the local residents were putting up stakeouts to predict that a UFO would come, particularly when someone had been newly placed. And some of these cases are quite extraordinary, and they involve not only sighting, but beams of light coming down, landings, humanoids being seen, and in fact, some of the graveyards are being disturbed, some of the actual grave site. And this comes from a lot of people. Jim and Cora Lorenzen had cases. Raymond Fowler had cases. So this is absolutely a thing. And that's one UFO attractor. And I found many of them. I mentioned rocket launches. That absolutely attracts UFOs. But I also found prison. Who would have thought? After finding out that there was a case involving UFOs hovering over San Quentin, which was photographed, by the way. I found cases all across the world of UFOs, not only hovering over prisons, but sometimes landing next to them. There were physiological effects. There were photographs or electromagnetic effects. So these are UFO attractors. Schoolyards. I ended up writing a whole book about UFOs coming down over schools, landing in 1/3 of the cases, or drive-in movie theaters. That was going to be a chapter in one of the Not From Here books, but I ended up doing a whole book on UFOs hovering over drive-in movie theaters, putting on displays. Again, this is the agenda of announcing their presence. I think is what's going on in a lot of these cases. But mines as well, all across the planet. I found some 30 or 40 or closer to 50 cases of them hovering over copper mines in Arizona, gold mines, diamond mines, uranium mines. Very famous case in Texas. And one of the attractors that I really wanted to explore, which I finally had the chance to in this volume 4, was dam, because UFO researchers have noticed that UFOs are hovering over nuclear power stations, electrical power stations, hydroelectric power station. I knew of a few cases. There was a case in Davis Dam in, I believe it's Colorado, might be Arizona, now that I think of it. The witness felt quite certain that the UFOs were siphoning electric power, the hydroelectric station. There's a number of cases in South America where this absolutely is taking place because there was widespread power failures. The whole electrical grid would go down when these objects happen so often that the residents called them rabones, means thief in Spanish or Portuguese. There was absolutely a connection here. And after going through all these cases, these weren't, again, just sightings. These involved landings and in a number of cases, humanoids as well. There was a case in 1964 at Lake Casitas, California, involving a military officer. His name was Lieutenant Frank Kinsey. He was there with his brother-in-law, the little man-made reservoir off the coast of Southern California. They heard this water, like a waterfall coming out of the lake, turning and saw this kind of egg-shaped object rising up out of the water. It had portholes. Through the portholes, they could see a humanoid looking down at them. And he actually had a camera ready. And as this object darted away, he managed to capture this object in a photo. You can clearly see the little porthole and what could possibly be a humanoid looking out. He says he did see the humanoid quite clearly when it initially came out. The photo does clearly show this object. It's right on the edge of the photo. It's a really good capture of one of these objects coming out of a reservoir. And it's shocking how many cases there are like this. And my first thought, I have, again, theories as to what's going on here. I think in some cases, yeah, they are siphoning up some of the electricity. There's a lot of accounts of UFOs hovering over telephone wires, a lot of accounts of UFOs appearing in association with power failures, such as the New York blackout, I would point to as a very strong UFO connection. So I think that might be one of the things going on here. I also think that's possible that they're checking up on our technology and how we're using power. But having talked to Dolly Safran, the subject of my book, Symmetry, she's a fully conscious contactee. She's got a real extensive base of knowledge about how ETs interact with humans. She's had hundreds upon hundreds of encounters and has worked with them directly. And she says, well, what's actually happening here is they're checking up, some of which have problems and might not be. And if you look into the history of dams, a number of them have failed over the years. So that could be another theory as to what's going on here. But it's absolutely undeniable that they are watching our dams and hydroelectric power station very closely. These cases reach back all the way to 1947 of the modern age of UFOs, pretty much to the present day. I think the most recent case I found was 2010 or 2011 rather. And that actually did involve humanoids. This was at the Campo Moro Dam in Sondrio, Italy. In August of 2011, more than 50 witnesses saw an object hovering over the area. And 1 month later in September, there was a pastor who was hiking in this area, saw a group of what he called, quote, little gray men, a group of them. And it was just 1 month later, there was a family camping in this area, and the son had hiked off from the campsite and saw what he described as a short, blue-skinned, gray humanoid with large eyes, which ran into a disc when he approached, and the disc took off. But with so many of these cases, it's clear there is a connection.
Many world leaders have had close encounters with UFOs and aliens. Could you tell me about who some of them are and what were their encounters?
I would love to. I think this is a very important fact. There's a cliche in the general public that if UFOs are going to land, they're going to say, take me to your leader. And I'm wondering, well, has this actually happened? Because there's a very famous incident, well known in the UFO community, involving President Eisenhower at Edwards Air Force Base, where he allegedly had face-to-face meetings with ETs in 1954. But he never publicly talked about it. It has been fairly well verified by UFO researchers, and I think it's pretty clear that this did, in fact, are there other presidents who've had direct contact? And of course there are. In 1975, Jimmy Carter, who would later become president, this is while he was running for governor, had a very close sighting along with 11 other people at the Lions Club. What he believes is absolutely a UFO. He was very vocal about it, to his credit. Researchers, well, debunkers, I would rather call them, tried to explain this away as a barium cloud or what have you. But Jimmy Carter stuck to his guns. No, this was absolutely unusual. It was quite close, very low, pulsating in brightness, seemed to approach them at one point, went off and disappeared. But he was one of very few people who are highly placed in government who has stepped forward fearlessly and talked about it. Most of them have not. Ronald Reagan is a good example. He was governor, and in 1974, while in a plane, he had a UFO encounter. And in fact, the whole crew saw it. Pilot, Mr. Painter, I believe was his name, saw it as well, did talk to the press about it. At some point, Ronald Reagan was interviewed directly by a journalist and admitted that, yes, he did have a UFO encounter. And when the reporter says, are you saying that you saw an actual UFO after, Ronald Reagan described the sighting? And according to the reporter, Ronald Reagan suddenly realized what he was saying and started to backpedal a little bit. But it was too late. Cat was out of the bag. Later, he would make some very provocative statements about the ET presence on our planet. So I started looking into this because it became clear to me that this was happening. Governor Fife Symington is a good example. He's the governor of Arizona, who was a witness to the Phoenix Lights, but absolutely denied it till years later, and he'd retired from office, become a pastry chef, so that, well, actually I was a witness to the Phoenix Lights. And as I started digging into the literature, I was shocked to find out, I mean, many of the presidents have made very provocative statements. The US certainly have said flat out, oh, I saw it, seen UFOs, I've had them. I suspect some of them have. I know that Kennedy certainly was interested, and Obama has made provocative statements. Many of them have made really interesting about the subject. Trump, but digging into the literature, I found a lot of senators and representatives from across the United States have come forward, leading all the way back to 1952. Female congressperson in Arizona, Isabella King, she saw a UFO. She had another witness, and to her credit, she stepped forward and talked about it. Senator Richard Russell of Georgia didn't publicly talk about it until he was basically forced to, and only said a few statements about it, didn't describe it in any detail, but the people he was with certainly did. And his was one of the early cases to really leak out and cause a lot of attention. And year after year, senators and representatives across the US are having encounters. And I think this is probably intentional. UFOs are showing themselves to world leaders because these are the people who are setting policy. These are the people who are responsible, lawmaking, promoting the welfare of the people and our planet. The best kind of person to go through who might have an actual influence, stopping wars, stopping pollution, feeding the people, and all the things that people need to thrive in a healthy atmosphere. I do think that this is an intentional agenda. So I started seeing it was like year after year in a weird kind of way, like a book tour, if you will, or a concert tour, where people hit from city to city or town to town. In 1973, Governor John Gilligan had a sighting, saw a UFO, it sent on a beam of light. It was 1 year later, Reagan had his sighting, 1974. 1 year after that, Jimmy Carter had his sighting. Is it a coincidence that 3 governors, 3 years in a row, had sightings, or is this intentional? I can't say for sure, it's pure speculation, but I will say it's not just the US has seen a UFO. He went public. President of Brazil, the president of Kalmykia in Russia, a province, he went forward with his report of a direct encounter. Countries all over the world. I mean, the president of Iran, even in 2013, talked about his encounter. So this is absolutely a thing.
Should viewers of Paranormal Yacker want to buy Not From Here Selected UFO Articles, Volume 4, how can they do that?
You can go to my website, prestondennett.weebly.com, and you can purchase it through the website. You can also contact me if you have a question or a comment or have a story to share. The books are available on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, other online retailers. I'm also all over social media if people want to reach out. I'm on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and YouTube. I really appreciate you having me on the show, Stan. I think this is an important subject, and it's time people wake up.
Preston Dennett, I thank you for being my guest on Paranormal Yacker. It's always a delight yakking with you.
Thank you. It's an honor and a delight for me as well.
Hi, everyone. This is Stan Mallow, the Paranormal Yacker. I hope you enjoyed the interview you just watched. To be sure you're amongst the first to receive new interviews when they're released and to have access to previous ones, subscribe to my free YouTube channel. To do that, all you have to do is press the subscribe button on your screen.